Hey there, my name's Charles, and in these series of videos, we're going through the Zero Trust for Web Apps reference architecture that's published in the Azure Architecture Center, as well as a tutorial that I wrote on how to complete or deploy that reference architecture. So in this video, we're going to focus on the application gateway. In prior videos, we've already got our virtual network set up, our Key Vault deployed, as well as our app service running on one of the subnets within our virtual network. So now in this video, we're going to focus on the application gateway, getting our web app firewall set up in front of our app service, getting the DNS in place, and then just kind of doing an initial test, making sure that it works there before we move on to the firewall. If you want to learn more about Azure, if you like the video, please subscribe to the channel, and we'll continue to make more of these Azure videos. Let's jump into the app gateway. So just to kind of visualize where we're at, so we've got our two virtual networks deployed. We have our VNet peering set up between our two virtual networks. We have already deployed our app service. It has a private network or a private endpoint on the app service so that it is in the app1 subnet, and we can access that app service only from within the virtual network. So the next thing that we're going to do is deploy this application gateway within that same spoke virtual network. And the app gateway is going to provide us some load balancing services as well as a web app firewall. So we can do anything with the OWASP rule set, which is just kind of like the top common type of web app rules, firewall rules that we would want in place in front of our app service. This could be preventing SQL injection, any cross-site server scripting, things like that. Anything that's in the OWASP rule set. So we'll go over to our documentation, kind of look at the tutorial, see the next thing that we're going to do, which is deploying the app gateway. We're going to call this My App Gateway. It is going to be a web app firewall version 2. For the purpose of the demo, we're not going to enable auto scaling or have any extra instances. Obviously, in production, you might want to reconsider that. If you have a high amount of traffic, you may want auto scaling. You would most certainly want at least 2 for high availability or some redundancy behind the scenes there. And so we're only going to put 1. We're not going to put them across availability zones or anything like that. As part of the app gateway, we will create a WAF policy. One thing to consider here is that the WAF policy should be in the same region or location that you put the app gateway. And so we're going to put all of this in the same region that we've been using in East US. And we're going to deploy this app gateway to our spoke virtual network and put it in the app gateway subnet that we previously created with the virtual network. As we go through the configuration, app gateways can seem kind of complicated because there's quite a few different components to an app gateway. There's a front end, and so that's just going to be a random public IP address. There has to be a backend, which will be the backend pool of the app service. And then there has to be a routing rule that kind of connects the two together. A listener, which defines the DNS that we're going to listen to, as well as the certificate to use. And so the listener is probably one of the most important pieces of this, because this is what we're going to say. We're going to be listening on 443 for HTTPS. We're going to go grab that wildcard certificate that we uploaded to our Key Vault using the managed identity that we created. And we have to specify the external DNS name for the web app. And then that needs to map to the certificate that we're using as well. So this is kind of one of the more, probably the most complicated part of this configuration, just making sure that all of these pieces are configured correctly and then kind of match appropriately to each other. And so we have that note here that the fully qualified domain name that we use here for the host name has to match what we put in DNS and needs to match our certificate. In this case, we're using a wildcard certificate, so it's not a problem. But if you have a explicitly defined common name in your certificate, that will need to match there. So we're going to go through this configuration, deploy our app gateway, get the web app firewall up and running in front of our app service. So let's go to the Azure portal. We will go to Application Gateways. It is in the load balancing section of the Azure portal. We're going to create a new app gateway. We will put it in the same resource group we've put all of our other resources. I'm going to name it My App Gateway. We will deploy this to East US. This is maybe the first thing we have to change here. We said we were going to deploy a WAF version 2, a Web App Firewall version 2. We're going to disable auto scaling. And to save us some money on the demo, we're only going to deploy one instance. So again, probably not best practice. We have no redundancy here, no high availability. It can't scale, demo purposes only. We're going to create a new WAF policy. We'll just call this Zero Trust WAF policy. Hit OK. The virtual network. Again, we already have that deployed. This is going to go in our Spoke virtual network and in our app gateway subnet that we previously created. So this is the first section. This is only the basics tab of the app gateway. We still have to do that front end, the back end, the routing rule, and then we can create it. So we'll go next to front ends. It will be a public IP address on the front end. If we go back over to our diagram, we are expecting a public IP. This is what the DNS is going to point to when we set that up. And so we're going to create a new public IP. This will just be My App Gateway PIP, public IP address. So that'll be the public IP on the app gateway. We'll go to backends. We're going to add a backend pool. This will be our app service. I'm just going to grab the name from the docs, make sure we use things consistent here. So my backend pool, it'll be an app service of our web app. And so we'll select app services here. And then that'll give us a drop down of all the app services in our subscription. We'll select the Zero Trust web app, the app service that we deployed in the prior video. So we'll select add here. Now we have a backend pool on our app gateway. We'll go to the configuration. And now here's where we have to add the routing rule, which is really going to just kind of connect that front end IP address to the backend pool with the settings that we define around that listener and some other pieces. So we'll add the rule. Just going to go over to the docs to grab a couple of the names. So the rule name is going to be my route rule 1 with a priority of 100. So that just kind of names the rule, gives it a priority, because we could have more than one rule if we had more than one backend pool. The listener name is just going to be my listener. We want it to be public HTTPS, so 443 for secure traffic. And then we'll select our wildcard certificate using the managed identity that we created. So listener name, my listener, front end IP address will be the public IP address that we selected. HTTPS, that automatically changes the port number to 443. Now it does give us the option to just upload a certificate. You could do that. Using a key vault does keep that certificate protected. If it's especially in this case where it's a wildcard certificate, and lets us put things like managed identities in front of it. So best practice would be to use a key vault, but you can just upload it manually here if you would like. So we're just going to call this wildcard cert. Select our managed identity. So that's the one we created earlier, my managed identity app gateway. We're going to select the key vault that we previously deployed and the certificate that we uploaded to that key vault. And so this is where the steps that we performed previously kind of come into play. So the app gateway is going to be using this managed identity to go and retrieve this certificate from the key vault. And so that access policy that we created in the key vault is what's allowing this to happen. From here, the next thing on the listener was that it's going to be multi-site, and then the host name that we set is what we want the DNS name of our web app to be. So this does need to match our certificate that's in Key Vault and whatever DNS zone that you create or the domain name that you've purchased. So in this case, I'm going to just do ZT web app, Zero Trust web app .hugelab.net, which is the domain that I own. and the wildcard certificate that we have. So that's the listener configuration. We have to configure the backend target to kind of map these things to the backend target. We already created our backend pool, so we can select that from the drop-down list. We do need to create some backend settings, how we expect the app gateway to communicate with the app service. So we're going to add new here, and we'll look at the backend settings that we have to define here. So again, this is how the app gateway is going to communicate with that app service. We're going to call this my backend settings. It's going to be 443. Everything's secure. We are using a well-known CA certificate. This is a public trusted certificate that has been purchased. And so if we were using our own internal CA, or if you had like a self-signed certificate that you were using, you would have to select no here and then upload the intermediate and the root certificate so that the app gateway knew to trust that certificate that maybe you created or used. So we'll go back over, put these in, my backend settings, HTTPS. It is a well-known CA that we're using. And then the next thing we had to do is override with the new host name so that the health probe is successful. We're going to do yes, and then pick that name from the backend target, meaning that it's going to use the name of the app service. And it's going to automatically create a custom probe for us, a custom health probe for the app service so that we don't have to create one. So those are the components of the routing rule. We will select add. And then add again. And now that routing rule shows up here in the app gateway. Then that's pretty much it for the app gateway. On the base configuration, we'll hit create, review and create, make sure it validates. Now this deployment will probably take 10 to 15 minutes. App gateways are not the quickest thing to deploy. We'll go back over to our documentation. It does say that we have to create a custom health probe. You saw there in that last screen, it creates that for us automatically. So we'll just kind of scroll down to the next step. And while that's creating in the background, we'll go ahead and add the DNS record for our app gateway. And so this will be an A record, since we're using an IPv4 address on the front end of the app gateway. I named it a little bit differently. I named it Zero Trust Web App instead of My Web App. And then it will resolve to the public IP address of our app gateway. So going back to the portal, as soon as our public IP address is created, which is this line item here, we can select that to be able to grab the public IP address of the app gateway. And then what we'll do is go to DNS zones, go into the DNS zone that you have for your domain, hugelab.net in this case. We're going to add a new record. I'm calling it Zero Trust Web App because that's what I put in the listener of the app gateway. It is going to be an A record. I'm going to change this down to 1 minute. I know the documentation says 1 hour, but I want to be able to change this pretty easily. So I'm going to set this to 1 minute. And then put in that public IP address of the application gateway, of the front end IP address. So we'll select OK here. And so now we have a DNS record called Zero Trust Web App, and that's going to resolve to the public IP address of the application gateway. So again, the app gateway is going to take a little while to deploy. We'll let that deploy in the background, and we'll come back to it when it's ready. All right, so our application gateway deployment has completed. We'll click on this. We'll use the search bar. We'll go to App Gateways, take a look at it. My App Gateway, you'll see on the overview page. Maybe hide this menu over here. We'll hide this one. The overview page lists the front-end IP address. So this is the 20.public IP address. This should be the same that we have now put in DNS as the A record for the domain name of the web app. And so now we'll just kind of test it out. We'll test our initial deployment, make sure that our web app firewall is working, that everything that we've got set up so far is working before we add anything else. The first thing we can do is go to the backend health page of the gateway to make sure that it doesn't have any errors or anything there. So we'll go to backend health. This should hopefully come back healthy. All right, there we are, backend healthy. And we'll try this out again. So we had the page that we'd used before, which was the domain name of the app service. If we try to get to this, it's still inaccessible. The app service itself has that private IP address, that 172.16. So now we have to use the domain name that we configured in DNS. And so in our case, we've got https ztwebapp.hugelab.net. And now we can get to our web app. So from a diagram perspective, we look at our diagram, we have DNS set up, resolving to the public IP address of our application gateway. And now we're not quite fully there. The app gateway right now is pointing directly to the private IP address, that private endpoint on the app service. So we're probably, a majority of the way there. We've got all our base resources deployed. We at least now have a web app firewall deployed in front of our app service. And if we go back to the app gateway and look at the configuration here, so it is a web app firewall v2. If we go to the overview, it is using a WAF policy. Well, it's not listed here. Go to SSL settings. We can create an SSL profile if we wanted to. On the web app firewall page, we have an associated policy. We'll select the policy here. And here's where we have, whether we're inspecting the request body that's on by default, as well as the default rules that are enabled for the web app firewall. And so it's using the OWASP rule set. As of the recording, we're on 3.2. And so all of these rules are enabled on the web app firewall by default. So all of these, the traffic would be inspected for any of these types of attacks on our website and be blocked at the firewall level. By default, the policy mode is set to detection, so it wouldn't necessarily block it in this scenario, but we could set this to prevention if we wanted it to just be outright blocked. That requires some extra testing and configuration in your environment. There are a lot of times where the default rules will in fact block legitimate traffic. So it's always great to start in detection mode, go through and do various checks and tests on your application, on your web app, and take a look at the logs to see if anything came back as, suspicious that it would have blocked, even though it might have been legitimate traffic, and then come in and maybe disable or change, add some exclusions, customize the rules as you need to. So that's deploying an application gateway. Now we're most of the way there in having a zero trust setup for our web app. That's it for this video. In the next video, we'll go through the Azure Firewall setup and get the last portion of the zero trust part configured. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, learned something new, please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel.